This is a jump. Cool. Simple, right? Sounds good. Take looked great. That's a wrap. Project over, right? Jumping is a simple and ubiquitous action that is commonly included in video games as a way for players to move. And, okay, I kind of want to talk about jumping, but that's not really what I'm interested in. Jumps are interesting enough on their own, but what I'm more interested in is movement. A video game is an interactive medium. The audience has as much or more agency than the characters, but it also has to be designed, which gets into, at least in my opinion, much more complex conversations about agency than you could get from any other medium. How do you create a space that can allow an audience member to exercise agency? When every action a player can take has to be programmed into the computer, how do you create an actual sense of personal expression? And how can a player use their agency to experience, explore, define, and expand a work? Those are big questions, and while they're fascinating, they require much more space than I could ever have to express them, so I'd like to narrow our focus a bit. I've always been particularly drawn to the movement in games. Movement is something that comes naturally and without thinking to most of us, and I'm fascinated by the way games can use our movement to play with our felt understanding of the world. Movement can help you identify with a character, grant you a thrill from superhuman agency, or even present its own challenges and conflicts to be resolved at your discretion. Movement is still a massive topic, though, encompassing almost every game where you directly control a player character, so we'll need to get a little more specific, bringing us to the jump. Jumping is pretty simple, but I still think it's worth taking the time to explain it, because I haven't just chosen it at random. This might get a little too detailed, but hear me out. In most games where the players are controlling a human character, they have a lot more control over the character's horizontal movement than vertical. That's just kind of a fact of gravity. And while there are certainly games where this doesn't apply, they are the exceptions rather than the rule. Jumping, in this way of framing things, is the player's way to choose to interact with this vertical dimension. Other methods, like falling or climbing ladders, take control out of the player's hands in some way, namely being locked to certain locations and limiting player movement in other ways, like being exclusively up or down. So jumping is fairly unique in it being a universal way to interact with the third dimension. This is useful because it lets us describe a jump as a tool. The role of a jump is to be a vertical movement option and gives the player a way of interacting with verticality in the environment around them. With an understanding of its role, we can now start to construct gameplay around it. You can't walk across this gap, so you'll have to play around with vertical space to get across. It's simple, but from this we get everything from tiny hops to flinging yourself across massive chasms. As an example, let's take this screen from Celeste, a 2D platformer, think like Mario. We begin with a small gap between two ledges. The other side is ever so slightly higher, which suggests the solution to us. We need to jump across. On the other side, a helpful little bird tells us how to climb up walls, another movement tool that we'll be using moving forward, specifically to get height back in ways that jumping can't. The next gap is pretty simple, so we don't actually have to jump to cross it, but then things get a little more interesting. If we just jump, we won't get enough height to make it to the ledge, and we'll fall down to this platform down here, and we can't get back up either unless we combine our tools. We jump, then switch to a climb once we reach the wall, pulling us up to this ledge. Finally, these last two gaps present another challenge of these tools, but add in a few new things. The most visible thing is air control. Here, we have to drop without jumping, because if we don't, we'll run into the wall. This is followed by a few small jumps, then a last jump which allows for a little bit of leniency. You can go directly into a climb, but it's okay if you don't. The other thing that this adds, though, is branching paths. Let's roll this back. Knowing what we know about how you can move, do you see any other way we can get across? Good work! I don't actually know if you figured it out or not. I can't hear you, but I trust you. We can go up. This wall is straight up, so we can just climb all the way up and jump to the other side. While technically we haven't ever climbed this high or jumped this far, an adventurous player can reasonably guess that it's possible, and gets rewarded with a flashier and slightly less complicated solution. That idea of flashier versus more mundane solutions does actually help us take a look back at the larger idea of agency, though. Celeste isn't exactly a game with realistic movement, or at least the challenges it poses to you don't align with what might be expected of a totally mundane protagonist, but at least the movement tends to stick within the realm of the physically possible. Okay, the dash is a little much, but you're still thinking about gravity and gaps in the same way that a normal person does. When I talk about agency through movement, I'm thinking much bigger. In a game, superhuman movement means superhuman agency, and it's represented in a way no other medium can really come close to. Because movement is such an integral part of how the player interacts with the world, superhuman movement can change the way the player views the world around them. It doesn't just let you get around faster, it shapes the way you have to think. We'll get into this in greater detail in further videos, but I want to look back to the player's perspective. Let's look at something a little more complex. What happens when a jump isn't your only way to move vertically? Spider-Man, Miles Morales, is an open-world action game starting the titular superhero, the junior Spider-Man in training, on a solo adventure while Peter Parker is out of town. Spider-Man, as a superhero usually defined by his unique movement, understandably has a wide range of movement options available to him and the player behind him. This makes a little bit of an issue for us. When you have so many options for movement in so many directions, swinging, climbing, falling, and jumping, how do you put together an understanding of how this character moves? Or to ask a potentially easier question, how does the player make sense of all the tools they have on offer? Spider-Man's answer is to go a little farther than Celeste and make all of your tools for movement situational. So the clearest example is the wall run. It's a quick and controllable movement that's easy to initiate and use, but it's only applicable when you have a flat surface to run on. Granted, that's pretty common while swinging around New York, but it's just enough to give the player clues as to when to use it. This simple system is expanded or shrunk for each tool the player has access to. For example, the super jump, which is distinct from the normal jump, it's a hold input and you have to unlock it from a skill tree, don't worry about it, is limited by its charge up time, so the primary situation in which you use it is to quickly leave the ground and get up to a good speed for your other movement options. Your web swing, on the other hand, is usable almost everywhere, but you have to have something to swing from, so if you're working high up above the city, you can't rely on it. Zip to point is fast and precise, but you don't really get to decide where you go, and you have to have the height on the point. And even the normal jump falls into this category. You can't jump in midair, but you can jump at the end of other movements, like swinging and wall running, so you learn to punctuate your movement with jumps to keep your momentum and give yourself a little extra speed and distance. There's only a single move that can be used anywhere at any time, the web zip, and it's explicitly designed to be a small tool to help you out of the rare situations where you'd otherwise have nothing else to do. Altogether, these seem to overwhelm with choice, but in the moment, it feels more like a flowchart. The movement is constructed to allow for smooth control that feels good and natural to the player. I know it may seem strange how I keep returning to very specific player experiences, but I want to emphasize them and the way the player thinks about them, because this is something that's kind of hard to relay in a medium like this, a video essay. I want to go through all this because I think it's important to be able to look at games from the perspective of puzzle design, and I do think that's where the vast majority of game design comes back to. The player has a certain set of tools, and the game designer has to create challenges that can be solved through the application of certain tools. Whether you're playing Left 4 Dead or Animal Crossing, the basic principles are the same. I can throw some flashy clips on screen and scroll through a list of movement techniques being used, but that doesn't help you understand the basic ways the player will be interacting with the game. And therefore, you can't look at it from the perspective of player experience. Video games are a medium based on audience interaction, and I think that experience is as important to critiquing these works as reading the text would be to a book. Just reading the script of a movie, for example, isn't enough to properly read the whole text, and in the same way, any of these formal elements described without their context to the player can't give us a full description of their impact. We're going to get to the more critically interesting stuff, but I want to be clear up front why I'm approaching things from this direction. I think movement and the ways a player is able to manipulate their character are really important to understanding player experience. and how the player is able to express themselves in the fictional space around them. That's what I want to read, and that's the direction I'm going to be approaching these games from.